Hi, everyone. This class is taking the place of a lecture for February 16th, and it's on modern day policing and racism. So, the overarching question for this presentation is: do police make us safer? And I'm using a lot of data and information that I've gotten from the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, and they have a lot of information out there for just regular citizens on lots of interesting topics. So that's where I got a lot of my information from. So the first thing to keep in mind is some of the words that we're going to use. Vocabulary, as you know, I love vocabulary, super important. So, across the country, there are more than 15,000 states and local law enforcement agencies with a collective budget of more than 115 billion with a B. Conventional thinking has often been that these police officers and this massive commitment of financial resources to support them are necessary to promote public safety and serve and protect our communities. After centuries of over policing of black and brown communities and the killing of countless black people and other people of color at the hands of police, and I would also add queer people as well, justifiable outrage and ongoing movements have emerged to challenge this prevailing narrative and ask a more immediate question, and that is, do we need the police to keep ourselves safe? So let's start with some basic baseline information, facts. First, police do not prevent crime. There's little to no evidence that suggests that more cops mean less crime and more public safety. And most police departments have incredibly low success rates on solving serious crimes. Chicago, for example, has an overall homicide clearance rate of about 40 to 22, 40%, 22% when the victim is black. So, police, the other thing we need to think about is police aren't spending much time on serious crime. Of the murder, rape, and aggravated assault incidents, about 95% of arrests are actually for a mixture of offenses that are unnecessarily criminalized. So, only like 5% of our police effort goes toward those murder, rape, aggravated assault cases. The other 95% are for things like Dante Wright being pulled over for possibly having expired registration tabs, and offenses that could be prevented with investments to address poverty, drug and alcohol addiction, and other societal issues that don't actually threaten public safety. That's something that we'll cover later on. So these words, divestment, uh, sorry, my phone is ringing, divestment and reinvestment refer to a shift of power, funding, and resources and responsibility away from the punitive and harmful institution of policing into more life affirming, community based, and community led support services. So, this term of defund the police has been, bastardized, and it really means to divest. In other words, take that huge budget and spread it into different social areas to help support communities. So defunding, in principle, it refers to the same reallocation, but and this has come from the BLM movement, Black Lives Matter. But now we're those of us who believe that policing is over budgeted and over initiated believe that divestment and reinvestment in public safety for safety's sake is the way to go. So the term abolition is another term that we'll be using this semester, and that is actually to replace our current system of policing and prisons and jails and other punitive programs like parole with other systems of public safety entirely. For many, abolition is the final goal in the divestment reinvestment framework. And finally, procedural justice. These are reforms that try to use the law and policy to prevent police abuses, to increase oversight of the police, and to increase transparency and improve accountability, but don't necessarily reduce the role that police play in our society. So, those are just some terms that we're going to be using. So here is the actual graphic that I was talking about before, about 5% going, most 5% of our police budget and our police manpower and woman power is only 5% for those serious offenses and 95% for other infractions, with a total of 10.3 million arrests made per year in the United States. Finally, police interventions, have shown to increase the chance of harm rather than reducing it, particularly against people who are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, disabled, LGBTQ+, migrant and immigrant, or low-income people. Police violence is one of the leading causes of death for Black men. 1 in 1,000 Black men can expect to die at the hands of police in their life. Realities like these demonstrate a serious need to re-examine our approach to public safety in a way that ends police violence, saves Black lives, and invests in life-affirming programs in communities of color, which is the crux of police divestment. So, how did American policing start? We're going to go back to the beginning, and you can see the timeline on here as you're listening. So, the inception of our policing system actually began during the slavery era. The first municipally funded police department in the country, municipally funded meaning taxpayers are paying for it, was in Charleston, South Carolina in the early 1700s. It was conceived as a slave patrol to monitor and surveil the Black enslaved population and prevent them from planning any resistance to efforts to achieve freedom. In 1868, the 13th Amendment ended slavery in the United States, except as a punishment for a crime. This loophole enabled police to arrest Black people in order to lease them to white business owners who used their forced labor in convict leasing agreements. Sheriffs and police departments would continue to enforce racial segregation long after the Civil War, including using Jim Crow laws. And then flashing forward to 1965 on our timeline, just as formal Jim Crow segregation is waning and the Black-led movements are calling for more rights and investments in their communities and their schools, another crucial moment in the history of policing takes place. And this is when President Lyndon B. Johnson declared a war on crime and appointed a crime commission to study it. The commission based communities as the solution. 3 years later, this became the basis for a new agency within the Department of Justice, tasked with granting hundreds of millions of dollars in federal money to state and local law enforcement. So 1965 was a huge push to fund our police. And here is Nancy Reagan just saying no to drugs. Our more punitive system hardened in the 1980s and 90s as federal laws supporting the war on drugs and tough on crime policies implemented harsher penalties for drug-related offenses and expanded prisons and police. The archaic ideology of the 1960s that aggressive racialized surveillance and increased police patrols lead to public safety persists to this day, despite a growing body of evidence proving the opposite and supporting alternatives. Policing culture, as a result, has resisted change despite attempts to reform. In 2014, for example, Minneapolis was one of the cities piloting the Obama administration's national initiative for building community trust and justice, a multi-million-dollar program created in response to national calls for police accountability. The Minneapolis Police Department implemented trainings on implicit bias, diversified leadership, and adopted body cameras and other efforts at procedural justice. Yet none of those reforms stopped Minneapolis police officers, including one of the very officers responsible for training new recruits, from murdering George Floyd in the summer of 2020. Nor did any similar reform prevent police from killing Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, Tony McDade, Philando Castile, and Sandra Bland, and countless others. And on January 6, 2021, Capitol Police failed to prepare for a coup of a largely white crowd consisting of law enforcement officials, while protesters exercised free speech in defense of Black lives were met with violent, militarized force the summer before. Why? Modern policing, rooted in white supremacy and created to oppress, control, and harm Black and brown people, is operating how it was intended. And procedural justice reforms are not enough to change something that is so systemic and deeply, deeply embedded in our culture. Instead, public safety in America needs to be fundamentally re examined, and the divestment investment framework is the way to do it. Some people believe it is the way to do it. So, police violence in America, combined with obstacles in discipline and oversight, make funding alternatives to policing at scale a challenge. But several examples of the divest and reinvest principle exist to show us that it's possible. In Eugene, Oregon, for example, 1 in 5 9/11 calls are addressed by Cahoots, a program designed to respond to severe behavioral mental health crisis in place of police. In Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, following the police killing of Daunte Wright during a routine traffic stop, the mayor has introduced and the city council has passed a resolution to create an entirely new Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention, which draws upon best practices and alternatives to policing models nationwide. Among other things, it creates a newly unarmed civilian traffic enforcement department with the responsibility of enforcing traffic violations in the city. In addition, the Breathe Act, originating from the Movement for Black Lives, represents a federal legislative articulation of the divestment reinvestment framework. And we know this is possible, first and foremost, and finally, because it already exists in white communities. So I want people to think long and hard about that. It's really, really important that we think about how Black and brown communities and white communities are policed and surveilled and interrupted in our daily lives. So thank you for listening. I want you to think about, you can replay this video and then please answer the question in the Blackboard discussion. Thanks and have a great day.